Hello, my name is Mike and this is the second part of Oversimplified's First World War video. I covered the one not too long ago, the first part rather, not too long ago, and I'm looking forward to getting into the second part of this. As always, I will try and fill in the gaps where the video misses out or oversimplifies to the best of my ability, and hopefully if you're watching this you find this entertaining or engaging, or you can learn something. That's the aim overall, and as always, please go and support the original content creators over at Oversimplified because they do some great work and I'm really enjoying going through their videos. But without further ado, let's get into part 2.
With both sides stuck in a hard stalemate, they knew this war wasn't going to be about taking territory, but about simply wearing each other down. The Allies had plenty of men to expend from its overseas dominions, and the British also started a naval blockade, so Germany couldn't import stuff, like food. Neither side really wanted a long grueling war though, so they both thought of ways to break the deadlock on the Western Front. Idea number 1, new frontiers. When the war first broke out, Australia was quick to take German New Guinea. The Allies also quickly jumped on Germany's colonies in Africa, and particularly in German East Africa, locals were enlisted as soldiers and carriers by both sides, leading to a tragic loss of life for the native Africans.
Because again, it's another thing to remember, just like what I said in the Second World War reaction videos, is that this was still a global conflict. This wasn't just European centric. There was fighting and troops from elsewhere involved. In particular in Germany, East Africa and stuff like that. In some particular regions they did pay a heavy toll, a heavy burden for being part of this conflict.
Some new combatants entered the war as well. The Allies' new friends were Italy and Japan. Japan was busy building itself an empire, so it was more than happy to take away German islands and colonies in East Asia. Italy actually had an alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary before the war, but after some tense relations, and then the Allies promising to give them some of Austria-Hungary's stuff, they switched sides.
Yeah, and again, it's almost quite strange when you think about how the Second World War starts, in that Japan and Italy actually end up on the side of the Entente, which ironically would be the side that they would be fighting against in the Second World War. But again, some of the causes for that were covered in the Second World War video. But however, again as well, kind of Austria kind of driving that wedge between Italy, and I believe, Italy was kind of, again, a newly formed state. This is something that people, I don't think necessarily recognise, is that Germany and Italy, as in the countries that we know of today, are not actually that old. As I covered in the last video, the German unification only happened in 1870, after the Franco-Prussian War, which was, I think, 1871, around that region, when the Franco-Prussian War allowed the German states to kind of pull in the remaining almost independent, or those other outside confederation states from Prussia. So Prussia and those German states combined into form what was Germany. And Italy was a similar case. Italy for a long time was independent city-states. There wasn't a unified nation. And so again, these two nations being unified, they're not very old. And Italy obviously in the First World War puts its bets on the Entente and sees an opportunity to take the fight to the Austrians, where they might be able to get some territory to kind of expand their own borders, their own new nation borders almost.
Italy opened up a front in the mountains here, but like everyone else, they were stuck in stalemate for most of the war. The Central Powers' new friend was a struggling empire in the Middle East.
The Ottomans.
The Ottoman were divided on whether to actually join the war or not, since they had been exhausted by the recent Balkan Wars. Some of the politicians who did want to join went off on their own and fired some shells at Russia, and then came back and said, "Whoops, looks like we're at war now." The Ottoman entry into the war was of particular concern to the British, since the Middle East was full of oil, and Britain wanted all of that oil. First, the Ottomans tried to attack Russia in the Caucasus Mountains, but they weren't prepared for the cold, and many of them froze to death. Then they crossed miles of desert to take the Suez Canal from the British, but that failed too. Then the Allies tried to take the Dardanelles at Gallipoli in a long and hard trench warfare campaign, but that also failed.
Yeah, Gallipoli is kind of almost like the preload to D-Day, a naval invasion. But however, it was relatively a military disaster, and there was a heavy toll enacted on the British, the French, and particularly the Anzacs, the Australians and the New Zealanders who were at Gallipoli. It was a disaster. The landing sites weren't weren't good. The terrain themselves, once they actually got there, wasn't ideal for either side again, much like the rest of it. But this is again why we're saying in the previous video is that again threaten Britain's interests. Britain's interest primarily before the start of the First World War. Britain's concentration and attention was outside of Europe. And so by getting the Ottomans in a strange way, it seems like a good idea, because it distracts the British, trying to strike at the Caucasus, Caucasus belong to Russia, but trying to strike at the Suez Canal, the gateway, the artery between the Mediterranean and India and the Far East. But for a long time as well, Ottoman Empire has been regarded as the sick man of Europe. At this stage, they used to be a very strong, powerful empire. They controlled the Balkans, and for centuries, really, you had the things like they threatened Vienna, major incursions into Europe. However, at this stage, the Ottoman Empire is very much kind of on its last legs. It's on its knees, and as I said, getting involved in this conflict again was the hammer blow that would ultimately bring it to an ultimate end, as we'll hopefully see with things like Lawrence of Arabia and the unfortunate Armenian genocide.
The Ottomans blamed their initial losses on the ethnic Armenians living within Ottoman territory, and the resulting Armenian genocide led to the deaths of 1.5 million people.
Yeah, so the Ottomans blamed the Armenians for their defeats, their downturns, and as a result, genocided them. And still, kind of to this day, the Turkish government rejects and denies the Armenian genocide ever happened. And it's one of the genocides that is least talked about or not very spoken about. That's a horrible sentence to say, but it really isn't. It's not recognised or remembered. But it was. You had an entire ethnic group of people who were murdered based on their ethnicity, where they came from. And yeah, it's just something to remember. Again, the whole concept of genocide isn't just reserved for the Holocaust, or just reserved to Japan's atrocities in China. It's happened in the Second World War, it's happened in the First World War, it's happened long before the First World War, and it's happened in conflict since. When you just need to look at the Balkans itself with things like Bosnia, the Bosnian conflict and stuff like that is this is just a bit of a ramble, but it's just something to remember, which I feel like a lot of people again don't actually recognise that there was an Armenian genocide in the First World War, and for a large part it still isn't recognised as an official genocide, and particularly by the Turkish government, they still deny it ever happened.
Then the Germans sent spies into Afghanistan to try to convince the Arab tribes there to rise up in jihad against the British and attack India. But that plan failed, partly because the spies got bored, brewed their own alcohol, and got drunk, which is a bad thing to do in Afghanistan.
Yeah, bad thing to do there.
Frontiers hadn't done much to change the war.
Not very good in alcohol.
Aware that the Allies had more men and supplies than them, the Germans knew they had to do something to break the stalemate. Before the war, there was a big conference that set out the rules of modern warfare. No chemical weapons, no killing civilians. Basically, don't be jerks.
Yeah.
The Germans held a meeting and decided to be jerks. Zeppelin air raids commenced over British cities. They also started attacking the Allied trenches with chlorine gas, and they used submarines to sink civilian ships.
Yeah, so again, the deliberate targeting of civilians. I've been to some of the places where there were the first Zeppelin raids, particularly as well around the southern coast of England. But also gas as well. Chlorine gas particularly is a terrible and horrific weapon. Searing, agonising pain. It essentially destroys the lungs from the inside out. And again, it was a terrifying weapon, not only for the British and the French, but also the Germans themselves, because when they unleashed it, it was dependent on the wind. And so that meant if the wind changed, it actually blew the gas back into their own trenches, and their own troops suffered the same. However, also, it must be said that after the Germans did use gas, some of the Entente themselves also did actually return the favour with gas of their own, which just becomes the cycle. And again, it is a terrible weapon because there wasn't really much of a defence to it. It's an invisible weapon. You had gas mask, obviously, But again, it's another weapon that nobody was used to. Nobody was used to fighting against or encountering. And not only that as well, is that it just made no man's land even more worse. No man's land was a mess of shell craters and ponds of stagnant water. It had rained and it was muddy. But gas also collected at the bottom of those shell holes. And so that meant that when people were going over the top or even behind the lines, if a soldier lost his footing and fell into a shell hole, or going over the top and seeking to take cover, the gas that would be sitting at the bottom of that would again kill them. And as I said, it doesn't discriminate. So it's a terrible weapon, and that's why again gas is banned. Banned from after the First World War. It is no longer used, and that's why it was such a big thing a couple of years ago when there was a alleged use of gas used by the Syrian government on rebels. Because again, it's a terrible and a horrific weapon, and particularly this as well. Germany's sinking of convoys or civilian crew liners, and one particular one, which was a major one, is the Lusitania, or Lusitania. I don't know how it's exactly pronounced, but basically it was a cruise liner that was carrying over 100 Americans. And when the Germans sunk this, it was similar to the rape of Lille in the invasion of Belgium. It was a massive propaganda, and it was a big part in driving American public opinion against Germany, because again it was viewed as American civilians had been murdered. They weren't involved in the war, they wasn't part of the war, and yet they were killed by Germany, and so that turned them against the war. However, again, having said, some evidence to suggest that these cruise liners were actually carrying some sort of war materials, whether that be weapons, whether that be artillery, whether that be torpedoes or various things, back to and from, using civilian cruise liners as kind of the guise that they were doing this. So, but however, if that was the case, which I do believe it has been proven in some cases, I think in the Lusitania itself as well, actually, when they dove at the wreck, they did find that it was carrying some war materials. Regardless of them doing that, the German decision to sink these ships ultimately proved costly as well, because it just turned public opinion even more against the Germans than it was previously. And that obviously, in combination with the Zimmermann telegram that hopefully we'll get to later, ultimately led to the American intervention as well, in the First World War.
One such civilian ship was the Lusitania, which had 159 Americans on board when it was sunk, further swaying U.S. opinion against the Germans. Not to be completely unfair to the Germans, the Allies also engaged in chemical warfare soon after, and they had been hiding anti-submarine weapons on their civilian ships, which let the Germans justify their attacks. Meanwhile, Austria-Hungary still hadn't dealt with Serbia, so the Central Powers enlisted some help. Bulgaria wished it was bigger and was still bitter about losing the Second Balkan War. The Central Powers promised to make all of Bulgaria's wildest dreams come true if they helped, so they signed on, and together they knocked out Serbia. The Serbian troops retreated through Albania, which was neutral but had some ties to Austria-Hungary. So Austria-Hungary entered Albania in a friendly invasion to chase down the Serbians. Many of them escaped by sea. It's 1916, and a lot is happening. As if they didn't have enough enemies already, Germany added one more.
The main two
list.
offensives.
Portugal had been getting a bit chummy with the Allies behind the scenes, and Germany didn't like that one bit.
Portugal.
Around the same time, the only sea battle of the war happened. Both sides had a new powerful class of battleships called dreadnoughts, but they were so expensive to build that neither side wanted to risk losing them in a battle, so they kept them in port, except for one time.
The Battle of Jutland.
And a bunch of them got damaged, so they didn't try that again. The UK started conscripting men to the army, so they had plenty of reserves, which is just as well because the Western Front was about to get brutal. The longest and one of the bloodiest battles of the war started when the Germans launched an attack around the French city of Verdun. The French defended it desperately, leading to hundreds of thousands of casualties. Under pressure, the French called on its allies to do something to draw the Germans' attention away. So the British started their own long and brutal fight, the Battle of the Somme, with 60,000 British casualties on just the first day.
And again, that's something that we kind of need to remember, is these numbers are almost unimaginable. And if you haven't actually been to the war cemeteries in Belgium or France, then I strongly recommend that you actually do, if you have the opportunity, because I've had the good grace to be there twice. visit the various cemeteries, and the amount of graves is staggering. It's unimaginable. And again, it's something that we kind of need to conceptualize, because when we talk about D-Day, there's this perception that D-Day was almost a massacre on the beaches, and it was a bloody mess and all that. And it was, don't get me wrong. There was untold suffering that happened on those beaches. But on the first day of D-Day, there was something like 5,000 fatalities from the Allies. I think it was a little less. I think it was about 4,500, and around 10,000 casualties. On the first day of the Somme, the British suffered 60,000 casualties, which is 6 times as much on one day. And the Battle of Somme would rage for months. And yeah, it's just a really sombering thought that we need to think about. I know as a historian, or a history graduate rather, I have a master's in it. You're kind of taught to kind of be objective. However, having been there several times myself, it's a very hard thing to be objective when you're talking about lives, because it's an important thing to remember is while this is an internet video and we joke and stuff like that, every one of those people were people. They had wives, kids, brothers, sisters, fathers, mothers. How many of those would rather have not been anywhere near there? How many of them would rather have just stayed at home? Or who thought this would be an adventure and it turned out to be the horrific thing that it was? And that it's not just British people, it's everyone who fought in this conflict. It's every one of those individuals was alive. And it's something that I think we overgloss far too much when we're talking about history. It's a bit like the old quote is, one death is a tragedy, but deaths in the thousands is statistics. And I think we need to change the way that we think about history. Is that, yes, while you're talking about battles and conflicts, you can talk about the thousands who died. But remember that they aren't just numbers, they are people. And as a result, we put the value of life, hopefully give the value of human life a lot more than perhaps it's been viewed in the past. But yeah, again, sorry, that was just a little bit of a tangent, but I strongly do recommend that if you do have the chance or the opportunity to go and see those war cemeteries, then in France and Belgium particularly, then please go, because they are sombering, as long as you're obviously respectful. But yeah.
It was also here that the British first used one crazy brand new piece of sci-fi technology. The Russians had been getting pushed back further and further into their own territory, but in response to the French call for help, they began a huge offensive, and did really well until they ran out of supplies and got stuck. Seeing how well the Russians had been doing, Romania decided now would be a great time to jump in and win the war.
Didn't go well.
And then they got pounded.
Yep.
The Greeks were fighting amongst themselves about whether to join the war or not. The king liked the Central Powers, while the Prime Minister wanted to join the Allies. After a brief national schism, during which the country split into two, the king finally abdicated and the country reunited. With Allied help, they began a new offensive. In the Middle East, Russia was pushing into Ottoman territory from the north. The British had also made a landing in Mesopotamia to protect Persia's oil fields, and they had also sent a small army up the Tigris River to try to take Baghdad, but the army got sieged in the town of Kut along the way, and eventually surrendered. A new offensive was launched from the south with all-out desert warfare. The offensive was aided by one famous British officer, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, who helped lead the Arab tribes in a revolt that wreaked havoc on the Ottoman supply line.
So Lawrence of Arabia is a quite interesting individual. He was an intelligence officer originally, I believe. And basically, he went behind enemy lines. He went round to the various Arab tribes and encouraged them to revolt. And some of this revolting was done with the promises of that after the war they would have like autonomy, or they would have various freedoms or independence that would be promised by the British. As it turned out, after the First World War, a lot of those promises weren't actually kept, or they were negated, and that didn't help matters. There was a lot of resentment from those people, but they did actually prove a very important part of the war in the Ottomans, because they well, a bit like as the video suggested, they absolutely wreaked havoc behind enemy lines. While you had Russians pushing from the north and the British, and by proxy the Commonwealth, pushing from the south, it's a lot harder to fight that, let alone two powers pushing on you. But it's also a lot harder to fight if you don't have food or munitions actually reaching there. And so sabotaging rail lines and stuff like that, which is what Lawrence of Arabia done, and hit and run tactics on various garrisons or patrols and stuff like this, caused the Ottomans a lot of trouble and a great deal more harm than they probably expected when they actually joined the war in the first place. I don't think the Ottomans necessarily were expecting the war to go as badly for them as it actually did. But yeah.
The time 1917 rolled around, everyone was exhausted. There were mutinies in the French army, the German populace was starving, and the war had drained all of Russia's supplies. There was no clear winner, and it was still anyone's war.
Yeah, so just go back to that so the French had been suffering mutinies. I think they had suffered a couple throughout the duration of the war. Just a lot of the French soldiers were simply having enough. You had the Germans, the British naval blockade particularly was absolutely wreaking havoc on the Germans at home, unable to import anything really, and particularly food as well. Like it's a lot harder to keep a war going when the population is actually starving. You know, the longer a war goes on for, the less popular it generally is, and the quickest way to make a war very unpopular is to have the population at home starving, because then you start wondering, well, why are we sending people off to fight in this war and we can't even feed people at home, civilians. And Russia particularly as well. Russia was being absolutely drained. They were still suffering huge casualties in the offensives. Although the Brezhnev offensive did go well, as I said, they did ultimately run out of supplies and logistics. And again, 1917, for any of those who know pivotal moments kind of in history, that would be the turning point, particularly on one front, and for global history as a whole, with the revolution in Russia, when the Tsars were overthrown, and eventually, well, two revolutions in Russia in that same year in 1917, but ultimately lead to the formation of communist Russia and what would then go on to be the Soviet Union. But that's skipping way ahead in years. But 1917, that's what I assume it's going to be, is the revolution.
Starving, and the war had drained all of Russia's supplies. There was no clear winner, and it was still anyone's war. The only question now was, who was going to break first? And the answer was Russia. Tired of not eating, and mad that a crazy magic homeless guy was calling some of the shots, there was an uprising in Petrograd, complete with riots and strikes. The riots turned into a full-scale revolution, and a new government overthrew the Tsar. Then a few months later, the Bolsheviks overthrew the new government.
Yeah, and so the revolution in Russia was coming for a long time as well. I mean, Russia suffered a embarrassing defeat in the Russo-Japanese War. Again, as previously said, you had people without food, people starving, and again, it wasn't helped as well that when workers were marching on the palace to kind of petition the Tsar to amend and kind of aid, the palace guard actually fired into the crowds. That just drew resentment. And then when Lenin returned, you had the Tsars being overthrown, and you had the provisional government put in place, and then you had the October Revolution, where the communists seized power, and that's how we know it. Then some Russian civil war later, and then you have the Soviet Union and all the fun that brings. But essentially, Lenin going back to Germany, and the Germans actually sent Lenin back to Russia because he was previously kicked out, was their attempt to stop Russia, to close that front, close the Eastern Front, and it did succeed. I mean, ironically, it would be their decision to kind of put a communist government in the east of them into power in the first place that would actually come back to bite them in the Second World War with the Soviet Union. But for the time being, the Germans did actually succeed in knocking Russia out of the fight with the implementation and the reintroduction of Lenin to Russia.
And they pulled Russia out of the war. This was great news for Germany, who now only had to focus on the Western Front. But there was still one problem. The pesky United States of America was looking increasingly like it was going to join the war. America had been selling supplies to the Allies throughout the war and was getting super rich off the back of it, meaning it was in fantastic shape and was dangerous to the Germans. So Germany sent a telegram to Mexico saying, wouldn't it be crazy cool if you guys attacked America? But the British intercepted the message, showed it to the Americans, and that was the final straw. American troops began shipping out to Europe. This was terrible news for Germany, and they knew their only hope now was to force France and the UK to surrender before the fresh American troops arrived.
Yeah, so that was what I previously said, which was the Zimmermann telegram, where, pretty much as simply as it said was Germany sent a telegram to Mexico to invade America. The British intercepted it, gave it to America, and it was almost a surefire ways because Germany was worried about America joining the war. They was worried about them getting involved, and so almost by surprise they decided that the best way to kind of avoid American entry into the war was to get Mexico to invade them. I don't know, well, I do understand why they done it, with the kind of idea that if America is fighting a war with Mexico, then they wouldn't have to worry about getting involved in Europe. However, it was a huge gamble. Just like the invasion of Belgium was a huge gamble, Germany sending that telegram rolled the dice, and it went very drastically wrong for them. With the assumption that Mexico would even, do that necessarily with America's growing might and strength. But also, the moment that telegram was intercepted, there was only one thing that the Americans were going to do, especially after the sinking of the Lusitania and stuff like that, which was already turning public opinion against the Germans. The one thing that they didn't need to do was to have a telegram intercepted where they are essentially trying to force another country to invade the United States. That's only going to have one outcome, and that is the United States entering the war in 1917, which just threw more might against the already collapsing Germans. Because although the Germans are winning in the east, they're quote unquote winning. They're still in a dire position. The civilian population is still starving, and the military essentially is still on the ropes. It is very close to collapsing. Germany at this stage is still very close to collapsing, and America kind of joining in 1917 is kind of almost the final straw that ultimately Germany was already struggling against Britain and France. There is rumours that France, again with the mutinies, could have struggled themselves, but particularly when Americans were involved at that point, again, Germany's already struggling position. That's just going to be the final straw that ultimately snaps.
It was now or never, so they started one final attack. They converged their troops and hit hard at the Somme and pushed the Allies back. They hit a second time for the north, and then again and again. With each hit, the Germans were spending more and more resources, while the Allies were getting better and better at repelling their attacks.
Again, it's similar in a little bit of a way to draw a parallel to the Battle of the Bulge, where Germany knows they're running out of time. In the Second World War, they realised that if they can punch through and win the Battle of the Bulge, then that means that they'll force the Allies kind of back. That will undermine their plans for the liberation of Europe, and that might be able to somehow allow them to turn east and then fight the Russians. And again, it's a similar thing here. Germany knows that they're running out of time. If America is just free to land its troops and its war materials when it has the freedom to do so, then it's lost. And so Germany attempts to try and break the war, try and have a decisive victory that can end the war, kind of bring it to a close, or at least a favourable standpoint for Germany. However, them having that concentrated power of might while making short-term gains ultimately only weakens their own downfall, as what happened here and as what happened at the Battle of the Bulge. Throwing all your weight into something to buy time is an act of desperation, and that's what it went on to be.
By the fifth punch, the Allies held the line and even pushed back. With American troops now arriving in larger numbers, the Allies launched a counterattack, and that was it. The Central Powers were being pushed back on all fronts. Bulgaria collapsed first, followed by the Ottoman Empire, then Austria-Hungary, and finally on November 11, 1918, at 11 o'clock, Germany surrendered. At the peace treaty, Germany was forced to reduce its military, accept war guilt, and pay the bill for the war. After indescribable suffering and millions dead, the world learnt its lesson and never had such an awful war again. For about 20 years.
Yeah, and so that's the end of the First World War oversimplified. And again, at the end there, they had the Treaty of Versailles, talking about the rules, or the terms of the treaty. And the term, I mean, although we briefly discussed this about in the previous Second World War video, Germany was restricted to only having an army of 100,000. They was restricted of having an air force and submarines and tanks, I believe, as well. And Germany was forced to accept war blame, war guilt, as it was called, blame for the First World War, which again, as previously said, Germany was not the people who started the war. It was a war that was between Austria and Serbia, Austria-Hungary and Serbia, and it spiraled out of control. Was Germany partly responsible for the war? Again, it depends on what school of thought you believe in. There are some schools of thought, like Fritz Fischer, for example, who's a historian who holds Germany strongly responsible for the outbreak of the Second World War. There are other historians who believe that it's partly Germany's to blame, and then there are others who propose that it was multiple different reasons. It was shared guilt for the First World War, not only Germany but other European powers. And then there are some schools of thought that are equally as outlandish as Germany being the solely responsible for the First World War, in that Germany was innocent in the First World War. Just like those who argue that Germany was solely responsible for the First World War ignore the fact that it originally originated out of Austria-Hungary and Serbia. There are also those who argue that Germany was innocent and the Triple Entente itself was an aggressive encirclement, and therefore Germany had to strike out to protect itself. Again, I think that argument is equally outlandish, as Germany is the only responsible one. And I think in reality it's a lot more complex, a lot more grey. Nobody knows for certain what the leaders were definitely thinking. However, that's kind of one of the beauties of history, isn't it? There's a lot to talk about, there's a lot to discuss. And of course reparations, which we spoke about in the Second World War video. These reparations would go on to cause things like the occupation of the Ruhr and not help with hyperinflation when the Weimar government decided to be big brain and print loads of money to pay those reparations. But there we go. That's the end of this video. I've hoped you enjoyed. Hopefully you've learned something, and hopefully it's been somewhat entertaining or informative. And yeah, as always, please go and support the Oversimplified guys. They really do a great job, and they deserve your support far more than I do. But obviously, if you do have extra support, then I'd very much appreciate a like or a subscription. It does help to know that if you enjoy this, or if you've learned something, or if you would like to see more of these. And without further ado, I'll see you in the next video. Thank you. Bye.